Never having been an altar boy, I never had a chance to do this. But I just want to draw your attention to two objects. The illuminated address over there and this bell were both presented to Tom Johnson after his presidency and speech to the Irish Trade Union Congress and Labour Party in 1916, which obviously took place shortly after the Rising. So maybe when we're finished, people can have a more detailed look at the objects, both of which are in the possession of the Irish Labour History Society in Beggars Bush. When I was taken over the role of president of the society a couple of years ago, or I was being cajoled into taking it on, I kind of said, well, what's going on? And some of my colleagues said, well, look, we have a plan. We would like to honour in some way or other, by way of a publication, the life of Tom Johnson. And I said, that's a great idea, but we need to make sure that it's not the usual hatchet job on somebody like that. And Ed Penrose, who runs the museum over there, said, well, I have a very good solution to that. You do it yourself. So hence the book on Tom Johnson. And just by the way, we have copies if anybody wants to purchase one afterwards. Just a small point, people were around at the grave, and Tom Johnson and Fred Johnson are mentioned on the headstone. The reason Mary Johnson isn't on the headstone was when she died, her remains were donated for scientific research, so she was never buried in that grave. But I think there's probably a piece of work for some of us to maybe get some sort of a little marker to add her name to the grave around there. Tom Johnson was born in 1872, as was more than typical at the time. Life expectancy was very short, and his mother died when he was 6. And his father and himself were alone together, and they migrated from the Anglican community into attending a Unitarian church, where the Sunday school conversations, as was very typical of the time, gave rise to very, very developed social awareness and socialism. And Tom Johnson ended up a member of the Independent Labour Party, which was a strong and vibrant precursor of the British Labour Party that we know at the moment. Again, as was typical of the time, he left school at the age of 12 and started off as an office boy, office runner, but worked his way up and became a commercial representative, initially for a fish company. And luckily for him, and luckily for us, that involved bringing him to Ireland, where he met Mary Tregay, who was to be his wife and lifelong personal and political companion. She was a woman from Cornwall who was teaching in Kinsale. They had, as I said earlier on, one son, Fred Johnson, who some of you would know as a film actor and an Abbey actor, and more of which anon. Eventually, Tom worked for a company that was supplying veterinary supplies, and he was based in Belfast along with Marie, and he got involved in the Shop Workers Union, representing commercial representatives, got involved in the Belfast Trades Council, ran for election as a Labour Party person in a deeply unionist constituency where he got 41% of the vote. And that's a good typical sign of him flying the Labour flag in a very hostile territory. He was involved in Belfast in cooperative, socialist, Gaelic League and IRB circles, and got to know on a personal and political level a lot of people who were subsequently involved in the revolutionary period. He became, through the Belfast Trades Council, involved in the National Congress and worked with James Connolly to oppose the attempts to align the Irish trade union movement with the British Labour Party, and subsequently was part of the moves that successfully established an Irish Labour Party in 1912. The Johnsons were close personal friends of the Connollys. When Connolly came back from America, the Johnsons put up some of the Connolly children for several months until the Connollys had established themselves in Belfast by way of working with the Transport Union. And Mary Johnson worked for a period of time both on an unpaid and subsequently a paid basis as the personal secretary to James Connolly in the Transport Union in Belfast. He moved from the Belfast Trades Council, got elected to the Irish Congress executive, and by 1913, obviously, there was the lockout. And Mary and Tom devoted themselves to fundraising on behalf of the locked out workers in the north of England, raised significant funds in the cooperative movement, which was channelled then into the food chips that came to Dublin. And Mary worked along with Constance Markievicz and other women leaders of the movement in Liberty Hall, distributing all those food parcels. Tom was elected president of the Congress, and at that stage it was the Trade Union Congress and Labour Party in 1914. And obviously the war then started, and there was no Congress the following year. Even though Tom knew Connolly and all of those, he had no involvement and no prior knowledge of the 1916 Rising, and in fact was kind of trapped in Wales, where he had been at an event, and had to work his way through a circuitous route back to Belfast. What's worth as a curiosity is to read his diaries of that time, as he gave a living day-to-day account of the attitudes of people as he travelled from Belfast down to Dublin, about their views about the Rising. And that's certainly worth looking at and maybe studying. The important thing about all that period of time was when the dust settled, Tom Johnson was the most senior trade union and labour person left standing. Several members of the National Executive had either been killed or imprisoned after the Rising. Larkin had gone to America, and Johnson was left to pick up the pieces, whether he wanted to or not. One of the major tasks he took upon himself was to release the records and funds of the trade unions that had been seized by the military. And that put him to the kind of heart of politics of the time. So in the revolutionary years, the first national prominence of Tom Johnson was in the anti-conscription campaign, where the general strike took place against the potential of the British imposing conscription across Ireland. This wasn't Tom Johnson's first opposition to conscription. From the very first days of the war in Belfast, he opposed conscription on the grounds that it was a way of eroding the position of workers, and he had an anti-war position as well as a, if I can call it, an anti-British government position. Interestingly, at the time of that general strike and the considerable fear in the country that there would be conscription, Johnson said there was only two forces in the country that were in a position to actually resist conscription: the trade union movement and the remnants of the volunteers after 1916. Johnson wanted to participate in the 1918 general election, but like many a general, he found he had no army behind him, and led the retreat and the eventual decision that Labour would stand aside to allow for a decision to be made on self-determination. One interesting point was that Johnson helped move the British Labour movement away from a position of being in favour of Home Rule into a position where they were in favour of Irish self-determination. A crucial move in getting one of the large parties in Britain to move away from a traditional, if I can call it, imperial position to a position that was in favour of us deciding for ourselves. Obviously, and I think Ivana will talk a bit more about it, Johnson wrote and drafted the Democratic Programme, and we can touch on this again. Importantly, during this period, Johnson was involved in several industrial disputes that were part of the struggle for independence. The Limerick Soviet, Johnson was sent by Congress down to Limerick. He always knew it was not possible to defeat the British Army there, but by keeping it alive as a flame of opposition to militarism for 2 weeks, where they produced their own currency. And even though subsequently people have criticised Johnson for his role, the workers in Limerick immediately after that thanked him for all the work he did at the time. He led and pursued a general strike in 1920 for the release of Republican prisoners, which was extremely successful. And most significantly, he was the key trade unionist in running the munitions dispute, where workers in the ports and the railways refused to transport British weapons or armed British soldiers. It went on for 6 months, and the best account of that is Peter Rigney's recent publication on it, but the best analysis of it came from a British Army general that said that the munitions dispute set back the British war effort by 6 months. much more significant from a military point of view than ambushes in West Cork or anywhere else. And I think it's important to see that the struggle for independence wasn't just gunmen behind hedges, but was a national movement of people struggling for independence. We move on, we get to the treaty and the truce and all of that. Johnson's view on it was that we sent our negotiators, we sent the people who were best placed to judge the outcome. They considered it was the best deal they could do, and therefore they should be supported. That stood in marked contrast to, for example, Larkin, who denounced it from a prison cell in America. I think Johnson was much more representative of the trade union movement and the national population at the time, even though he strongly criticised many elements of the treaty, and in particular the oath. And this was to dominate the 1920s. His view on the oath was very simple. I don't like it, but it's a formality to get into Parliament where we represent workers. This is what workers' organisations do all across the world. How many of them support monarchy, but they take a pledge to monarchs in many, many countries, even though they'd like to get rid of them. It was a lesson. It took De Valera and Fianna Fáil, 5 long, bloody years to come to the same conclusion. As the, I suppose, situation heated up in the lead up to the Civil War, Johnson acted as a go-between. He put forward a proposition to both sides that there should be a referendum on the treaty. Interestingly, that was accepted by Collins and Griffith. It was rejected by Dev because he didn't believe that the electoral register was sufficiently in date. If ever there was a technical argument against letting people decide on the outcome of something important. The important thing, and I think again Ivana will make this point, when the Republicans were boycotting the third Dáil, Johnson and the Labour Party created Irish parliamentary democracy by forcing, first of all, an election would be held, second of all, that the Parliament would meet, because there was, during the Civil War, there was no enthusiasm on the part of the Free State government to allow the Parliament to meet. And it took from June, when the election took place, until the 9th of September for that Parliament to meet. And it only met because the Labour TDs all said they would resign their seats unless the Parliament met. And during that period, from Labour entering into that Parliament to the end of the Civil War, they held the government to account for all the terrible things that happened. They denounced the Republicans for their opposition and armed opposition to the majority of the people, but they denounced the Free State government for all the extrajudicial killings and so on. And interestingly, despite those terrible times, there was a constitution being built. And Labour, interestingly, and it was a constant through Johnson's life, he argued two things that were not being said by anybody else. That we needed to develop the economy by way of getting trade unionists and employers and government into a room to talk to each other with a view to increasing productivity. It wasn't going to eliminate the class differences and the class struggle, but it was going to provide some sort of a platform whereby there could be some sort of dialogue between the social classes. And the second thing was he constantly opposed efforts to marginalise the role of women in the Constitution and in Irish society, and whether that was around jury service, economic activity or anything else. And by holding that government to account during the entire period from 1922 up to 1927, Johnson helped lay the foundations for the democracy that we still enjoy in this country, and I think that's really important. I won't dwell on this, the highlights are in the book. Johnson nearly became Taoiseach. 1927, again with Johnson cajoling and helping and facilitating, Fianna Fáil eventually entered the Parliament. And an interesting thing here was Johnson saw that getting that larger party into the Parliament, which would have marginalised Labour as the leader of the opposition, was good for our democracy and good for our society. And that's, I think, a lesson to be learned about the role of Labour in underpinning and copper fastening our democracy. Fianna Fáil said that they would support a Johnson-led Labour government. It was a famous vote. It was a tie, and because it was a tie, the Count Corla voted for the government, and so be it. Interesting thing, it's mainly blamed on Alderman Jinks, who was waylaid or taken into a pub or whatever. But the interesting thing was the man who ended up as the next leader of the Labour Party after Johnson, T.J. O'Connell, was actually at an education teachers union conference in Canada. And you know, if he had been around, Johnson would have become Taoiseach. The subsequent general election, Johnson lost his seat. Why did he lose his seat? He was attacked from both sides. He was attacked by all and sundry as an Englishman, in a nakedly racist thing. How could you have an Englishman as leader of Ireland? And also he was attacked by the far left through Larkin and the Irish Workers' League, who saw them as betrayers of the working class. And Johnson lost his seat. He subsequently became a senator. He subsequently played a significant role in the Housing Commission in the 1930s, when Fianna Fáil appointed him to persecute local authorities to build local authority houses. If ever there was a role that should be created again, that was a role. And subsequently then, with the agreement of the trade union movement, when the Labour Court was established in the 1940s, in 1946, Johnson was appointed as one of the worker members of the Labour Court and continued to serve for another 10 years, eventually retiring at the age of 86. There's one now that maybe some people with bad thoughts in the Department of Finance would encourage. Just finally, to make a couple of points, I think it's important in the context of this that we see Johnson just doesn't belong to the trade union movement and the Labour Party. He is a national figure and should be seen as such. Several times at the vulnerability of our parliamentary democracy, he played a key role in saving it. He maintained the unity of the trade union movement through World War I, which is a significant achievement because, just think, after the 1916 Rising, there was a whole Republican wave in parts of the country, and the Somme took place at the same time. And while Connolly and others had been killed in the Rising, delegates to the Congress had been killed wearing a British Army uniform, mainly from the northern part of the country. And those delegates deserved and were honoured by Johnson in a parallel way with others. And that unity of the trade union movement, not the Labour Party, but that unity of the trade union movement, north and south, 32 counties, has been preserved ever since, and certainly that is down to the role that Johnson played in holding it all together at that point of vulnerability. We all see in the Labour movement, trade union movement, Labour movement, that the giants are Connolly and Larkin, and they are. But I would certainly make the point that there is a third giant who hasn't been sung about to date and should be from now on, and that's Tom Johnson and his great wife Mary, who I haven't given as much time to, but one important point about Mary: she was the first elected Labour Party councillor in the Dublin area when she was elected to the town council in Rathmines in the 1920s. And interestingly, in the 1950s, when Desmond Greaves was interviewing them, she said that she was always a more revolutionary woman than he was. So I'll leave it at that, and hopefully you whet your appetite for more on Tom Johnson.
Thanks so much. And good to see there's a strong Labour tradition of losing your seat and ending up in the Senate. Fully support that tradition. And as I suppose the keeper of the flame of Mary Johnson as being a representative for Rathmines.
Thank you.
Everybody please, Vanna Batchik.
Thank you very much, Aon. Friends and comrades, delighted to be here today to join with you in commemorating the life of Tom Johnson. And it is nice to know that we have a tradition of revolutionary women in Rathmines, so I'm happy to continue that tradition. I do want to thank Shay Cody Shay, thank you so much for giving us such a clear and insightful overview of the lives of Tom and Marie Johnson, and really of I suppose bringing a new light to bear on what, as you say, had been really a neglected area of Labour history, which is their lives, their careers, their contribution to Irish society more broadly than to our party or to the trade union movement. So I want to I suppose give a brief reflection on the life of Tom Johnson, but also try and speak to the relevance of Tom and Marie Johnson's vision for Ireland today, for us in the Labour Party, for our society. I do want to thank not just Shay, but also Jack Eustace, Chloe Manahan and Ronan O'Brien, all of whom have had, and indeed Paul Daly, who's here, all of whom have contributed to what I'm going to say. And it is very nice to be in a packed room, may I say, for at an event like this, and very nice that we could take shelter from the graveyard. Aon said this was like a wedding, and I suppose it's more like a funeral if we come from the graveyard. But we do want to celebrate and commemorate Tom and Marie Johnson today, and we want to do that because Tom Johnson was not only a founding figure of our party, a leader in the labour and trade union movement here in Ireland, but also, as Shay has said, a man whose conviction, whose activism helped define our movement, but also helps safeguard and nurture our fledgling national democracy and indeed our state as we know it today. And that's really important, I think, Shay, as you say, and it has been overlooked. Tom Johnson was a man defined by his values, and these were also, of course, values that Marie shared. A socialist, a trade unionist, a believer in a progressive, equal and secular Ireland. Tom and Marie have long been neglected figures in Irish labour history. If I was still lecturing, I'd probably lecture and students' mobile phones go off. I have a colleague who used to take a very particular view, but we won't. We'll maybe move on. Shay and the Irish Labour History Society have played, and indeed Forza and SIPTU have played a huge role in reclaiming those forgotten histories. Earlier this year, I was proud to launch the biography of T.J. O'Connell, the leader after Tom Johnson, who took over in 1927, who Shay spoke about. And he's been described as the forgotten leader. And I said when I was launching his biography that those were words that struck a chill into my heart when I, as a new leader, to read about somebody who was a forgotten leader. And the other thing that struck a chill in my heart was that incident that Shay mentioned, the sort of critical vote in 1927, where T.J. O'Connell was absent in Canada at an education conference. Of course, he was a pioneering teacher and INTO official, and Alison Gilliland follows his footsteps in that. But he had been assured before he left these shores by his party whip that he wouldn't be needed because there would be no crucial votes coming up. And any of us in the Oireachtas, hear those words with a chill, because of course it would have taken him weeks to travel back from Canada. He couldn't make it back for the vote. So, and the rest is history, as we know. So we are the keepers of the flame of Tom Johnson, of Marie Johnson, and of so many more of our founding figures in the labour movement. But today, as we mark the 150th anniversary of Tom Johnson's birth and recall the near century of public service that he and Marie gave to our movement and our country, we should reclaim and celebrate the vital role that the Johnsons played in our shared history. So Shay has spoken about Tom and Marie's early lives and indeed their partnership together. They were Irish not by birth but by choice, and that's an interesting feature of their lives. Tom Johnson is indeed said to be the first person to apply for citizenship of the new Irish state. So he was a citizen by conviction, which itself is of interest, I think, to us. And therefore he had a belief in Ireland, and a belief that was profoundly distinct from his nationalist contemporaries. He believed in an Ireland with a confident, united working class from all political and religious tendencies and none. And he worked harder than anyone to make that vision a reality during his time as a union organiser in Belfast. Shay has alluded to that. His story speaks indeed to the tragedy of partition, and it's worth pointing that out because, of course, no movement was sundered by partition like the Labour movement. And I spoke at the time, I was proud to speak for Labour Youth at the Tom Johnson events in Belfast this summer, and I thought it was really fitting, in tribute to James and his colleagues in Labour Youth, it was really fitting that we would meet in Belfast to commemorate the life and the vision of Tom Johnson. Because Johnson sought to bridge the divide, to cross the community divide engendered at the time. And through the difficult years that led to the terrible division of the island, Johnson never ceased to agitate for a better outcome and a united labour movement. Civil wars seldom produce many heroes, but Tom Johnson was a rare individual who stood out, and Shay's alluded to this, for the principle and integrity of his actions all through the revolutionary period. His movement, the Labour movement, was active and vigorous in a pursuit of a more just social, economic and constitutional order. Shay has remarked upon Tom Johnson and the Labour's leadership in the movement against conscription, in the movement in the general strike against the British war machine during the War of Independence, which again has really been an overlooked part of that war. And of course, Johnson also secured recognition of the Socialist International for Ireland's right to statehood, which brought fresh legitimacy to the struggle in the eyes of the world. And of course, Johnson played a huge role in the formation of the new state through his authorship of the Democratic Programme, the powerful words of which still resonate, I think, with us all today. And indeed, he played a seismic role in his through taking up the leadership of the opposition in the Dáil that met, as we know, the Third Dáil on 9th September 1922, exactly 100 years ago this week, which followed the general election in June of that year, in which Labour won an historic 21.4% of the first preference vote. An achievement not yet surpassed. Not yet. So these are Johnson's most well-remembered legacies, and the reason his portrait hangs in Leinster House today. For us, his legacy as architect of the Democratic Programme is particularly important because it has soaring aspirations, really significant aspirations for an independent Ireland and for a society marked by equality, tolerance, by public ownership, by public good over private interests, and by dignity for all. And taking those principles on board, he took on responsibility in 1922 for holding the then Free State government to account for failing to deliver on those aspirations. Because, of course, we mustn't forget that the country which emerged through those years of struggle was not the country that he had envisaged. It was not a state that was true to the values that he had embraced. He had thought deeply about what was best for Ireland, and his ideas and politics were both pragmatic and radical, going far beyond what the conservative instincts of Cosgrave and of De Valera would allow at the time. And nowhere is the difference more clear than in comparing Johnson's original draft of the Democratic Programme with the version eventually passed by the nationalist politicians of the First Dáil. No private right to property is good against the public right of the nation, wrote Johnson in one passage, later heavily moderated in the final text. And in another, he had originally written that the Irish Republic shall always count its wealth and prosperity by the measure of health and happiness of its citizens, a sentence deleted in its entirety. He also had inserted a line originally that it shall be the purpose of government to encourage the organisation of people into trade unions and cooperative societies, again deleted, but words that spoke to his profound commitment to trade unionism as a vehicle for delivering progressive values and for overcoming artificial divides between working people. He called, in what would have been the final part of his preferred text, he called on the Republic to eliminate the exploitation of workers and bring freedom to all who have hitherto been caught in the toils of economic servitude. Really powerful words, and we can only imagine now and how Ireland would have been in the 1920s and 30s and even today if it had been shaped in accordance with those declared principles. But we should now take hold of and reinvigorate Johnson's bold vision for a nation free of economic exploitation and use those words as encouragement and inspiration for our campaigning work today. Of course, much of modern, contemporary 2022 Ireland would be strange and unfamiliar to Johnson, but still today we have poverty, we have economic hardship and yes, economic exploitation, and we still have struggling families and struggling households. And even cycling here this morning, seeing people sleeping rough around the city centre streets, sleeping rough in the doorway of Liberty Hall, these would have been sights that would have, I think, brought profound pain and regret to Johnson were he to see them today. Because today, close to the centenary of that powerful democratic programme, we see a combined series of crises that are really causing enormous hardship and enormous fear in households across the country. A cost of living crisis, an energy and security crisis, and a really chronic housing crisis. And these crises are driving people into debt, into hardship. We're going to see yet another generation of young adults forced out of the country into emigration because they cannot afford security of homes. And so our Party, the party that takes its leadership and its vision from Tom Johnson, from the democratic programme, from the vision of our founders, we must take on that reforming zeal and work to implement the vision as relevant now as it was at any point in Johnson's life and career. And we must work also to bring a sense of hope that is needed now more than ever, or as much as it was back in the 1920s and 1930s. We do now have a successful macroeconomy. We have nearly full employment. We have this paradox of plenty, as my colleague Marie Sherlock has described it, where we see a €6.3 billion surplus declared by the Exchequer, and yet we see families forced to choose between heating and eating. We see delivery riders, well, I won't mention a company, but we see couriers delivering food and yet unable to buy food to feed themselves. And we see people still sleeping rough on the streets of our capital city and on streets in towns around Ireland. So on fundamental issues of shelter, of food, of fuel, our government is failing, asleep at the wheel and appearing incapable of showing a way out of this crisis. This government is not acting with the urgency necessary to address the crisis. It's not acting in the interest of the common good and the public interest, and it's not acting to deliver state-led solutions and state-led measures in the way that was done during the COVID pandemic. A family looking for hope or competence or certainty will see government buildings where the lights are off, the shutters up, the blinds down, and the heating off, of course, too, as we face into the winter. So speaking as I do with families and households in my own constituency in Dublin Bay South, but also across the country here in Dublin Bay North and around the country, it is striking to me how many people, even those with relatively good incomes, a year ago able to cope and to meet cost of living, how many people are now no longer able to meet the rising costs of living. People who have to think twice about bringing children to the doctor, people who are seeing a doubling and maybe even a tripling of their energy bills next year. So many in our community are being failed by this government. It is not working for them, and we in Labour must seek to address that. We must put forward policies that would look to build an Ireland that is working, an Ireland that is working for all. And we are putting forward a series of policies on key issues around care, around climate, around housing, and around jobs that will seek to deliver change for people, the change that people are so desperately looking for. And that's in keeping with that vision, that radical socialist vision of Tom Johnson, his vision of a democratic society in which economic security and opportunity were the birthright of every citizen. We remember that Tom Johnson took stances that were unpopular at times. He opposed the ban on divorce implemented by the Free State government. He opposed the retrograde views on women's role in society, as Shay has said. So he was ahead of his time. But he made the case passionately and with conviction for the principles that he believed in. And I believe as a Labour Party today, we must continue to do that, to put forward a bold and radical vision in keeping with our core principles, but also in keeping with measures that will address the real hardship faced by so many households and so many families. And in this Ireland, in today's Ireland, we are calling for policies that will deliver for thousands of working people and struggling households. We have called this week for key measures to be adopted by this government to address the energy crisis, for a windfall tax on the excessive profits of energy companies, for a cap on energy prices for households, and for an expansion of the criteria for eligibility for the fuel allowance. Targeted measures, but also universal measures that will address real hardship. In the face of a chronic lack of housing, we've called for a massive state-led house building programme, public homes on public land, for the state to invest money in delivering security of homes for people. And we've called for the government to pass our Renters' Rights Bill to give real protections to those caught in a trap of spiralling rents and insecurity of tenure. And we are also calling for a series of very much needed emergency measures to get us through the cost of living crisis. We've called for a cap on childcare costs to €200 per month, a radical intervention in keeping with Donogh O'Malley's intervention 50 years ago, where he brought forward, almost overnight, and apparently without consulting with his cabinet colleagues, he brought forward free secondary education for every child, a principled vision of universal free access to secondary education, ahead of its time, but as it was seen at the time, but in retrospect, a hugely important practical step that paved the way for economic progress and prosperity, and indeed the realisation of the potential of so many young people who would otherwise have struggled to continue. We need that Donna O'Malley moment for childcare and early years education, and Labour women have been to the fore in promoting a vision of equal early years, of universal publicly funded childcare, and we have been pushing for that. But at the same time, right now, we need to see government commit to that vision, yes, but also say we're going to invest in early years education and care, and we're going to ensure that families should not have to pay more than €200 per month, around a European level of fee for childcare that will make a radical difference to struggling households around the country. And we've also called for a climate ticket on public transport, to adopt the idea first put forward in Germany, where we saw a €9 per month flat fee covering the full cost of public transport everywhere in Germany. And I see our detractors saying, but we don't have the same public transport infrastructure. Well, we need to build that, and to build that, we need to encourage more and more people onto public transport. And there's no better way to do this than to ensure that people feel they're supported, feel that they can afford to, and indeed feel that they can't afford not to go on public transport, to switch to public transport rather than private cars. And we've seen massive impacts not only on household transport bills in Germany, but also on having a real effect in reducing carbon emissions. And we have also called in this budget, as another measure that the government must introduce, the extension of free GP care to all children. Shay has pointed out that central to Tom Johnson's vision was an Ireland in which children's rights would be promoted, would be recognised, would be implemented. And here in Ireland, we still have chronic rates of child poverty, and we still have not ensured that families know they can take a child to the doctor without payment. When in government, we did bring in, and historically, free GP care for under sixes, but this government and the previous Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael government did not extend that, and we need to see that extended. It's affordable, and again, it's a necessary measure to bring real support to struggling families. Just as in Tom Johnson's time, there will be people now who say this can't be done, that these measures are unaffordable or unimplementable. But we say these are just some key specific measures that can and should be introduced in line with Labour's values and Labour's vision, but also measures which are necessary now to alleviate the costs faced by so many households and to address the failures of market-driven policies of this government and the previous government. Because we know people deserve better, our communities deserve better. We need to see an Ireland that works for all, and we in Labour must continue to play the role we've always played in seeking to deliver on that vision of an Ireland that works for all. So, comrades, in conclusion, in keeping with the spirit and values of Tom and Marie Johnson, we need as a party to continue to put forward a radical vision, to continue to hold government to account from opposition, and to continue to put forward our ideas, our centre-left, social democratic and socialist principles, principles which rely on a state-led, publicly funded series of public services, of childcare and early years education, of healthcare, of elder care, and indeed of housing, and of the solutions we need to tackle the existential climate emergency that we face today. The current government, as in previous Conservative governments, have always acted to temper the ambitions that were expressed in Tom Johnson's democratic programme. Such conservatism continues to create a culture in which market ideology is elevated over the interests of the common good. Our task as Labour, as the proud inheritors of the mantle of Tom and Marie Johnson, our task is to combat that conservatism, to strive every day for an Ireland in which Labour values of equality, solidarity and fairness are implemented to deliver an Ireland that works for all, an Ireland that embodies that progressive vision of Tom and Marie Johnson. And I look forward, comrades, to working with all of you over the months and years ahead to deliver on that vision, to build an Ireland that works. Gura maith agaibh go léir.
Well, thanks so much to our party leader, Ivana. Thanks to Shay. Shay has reminded me that if anybody is interested in purchasing the book, we can. Well, he wasn't putting it like that. But if anybody is interested in purchasing the book on the life of Tom Johnson, it is available outside. There are refreshments due here in around 12 o'clock. So if you want to maybe stay, share some thoughts, ask some questions, have some debates. Get your selfies with Ivana. We'll be able to facilitate that. But I did want to it is fascinating what Ivana said about what Tom Johnson wanted to put into the first democratic programme at all, which the Conservative forces demanded that it would be omitted. But this line did get in, and just as Paddy has his little fella there, it was important to restate it. It shall be the first duty of the government of the Republic to make provision for the physical, mental and spiritual well-being of the children, to secure that no child shall suffer hunger or cold from lack of food, clothing or shelter. He wrote that in 1919. That's our mission today. And as I said at the graveside, it's time for us, I think, to get busy. So thanks so much for your attendance. I hope you can stay to enjoy the refreshments, and I hope you can take the time perhaps to purchase the book. And again, thanks very much to Ivana and to the members of Dublin Bay North Labour Party who have been central to organising this event today in Clontarf. Thanks very much, everybody.